Hello, and welcome to my summer in commentary of Part 6 of the introduction of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. This is an interesting section because he really digs into his criticism of the ancient medieval modern scheme, what he calls a rectilinear program of world history, so this linear progression from ancient to medieval to modern. And he considers this a Ptolemaic, a geocentric, a Eurocentric view of history. And what he wants to do is to propose a Copernican system where the West is just one of these many planets of cultures, indulging this metaphor. So let's get into it. So he begins by asking, what then is world history? And his answer is that it's an ordered presentation of the past, and it's an inner postulate, an expression of a capacity for feeling form. But a feeling for form is not form itself, he cautions us. And he further says, even today, it is only forms of world history that we know, and not the form of world history, which is the mirror image of our own inner life. So again, this emphasizes the psychological nature of Oswald Spengler's comparative morphology. He's really looking at the inner life of each of these cultures. Then he criticizes others for taking this traditional ancient medieval modern conception too credulously, accepting it without enough reflection, without actually testing its assumptions. He says the current layout of world history is an unproved and subjective notion. So he wants to, through this phenomenological, psychological, comparative approach, to get past the unproven and the subjective and to reach a deeper truth about the form of history. Then he really digs into his criticism of the ancient medieval modern scheme. He calls it an incredibly jejune and meaningless scheme. So I like that a little bit. And he says, historians have been gravely influenced by preconceptions from geography. And I think this is a very insightful point. We look at a map and we see America, we see Europe, we see these different land masses. And in this case, he's focusing on Europe. And he's saying there's no real Europe. And then it's a delusion to speak of the Hellenes, the ancient Greeks, as if they are European antiquity. Yes, Greece and England may be on the same continent. Greece and Germany may be on the same continent in some sense. But they're different cultures. These different cultures can exist. And why would they clearly delineate between continents? That's kind of a simplistic notion that there would be any one-to-one correlation between geographic distribution on a continent and different cultures. So he says there's no real Europe, that's a delusion, and we need to get beyond these preconceptions from geography. And further, because again, a big point for him is that Western and Russian culture are different cultures, each its own organism, each with its own interior form that is actualizing itself in different forms of art, in different forms of architecture, in different thoughts, different religious thoughts. So, excuse me. So this is, again, because Western Russia is in Europe, many people, in Spengler's view, mistake Russia as part of Western culture. So he further criticizes Peter the Great's reforms. Excuse me. Peter the Great was an 18th century Westernizer who St. Petersburg is named after. And I love this part about Spengler, is he's going to challenge anything that's conventional. So for a guy like me, I think of Peter the Great, or I did, as a great guy, right? Because he's westernizing Russia back in the day. Somebody from America, or from the United Kingdom, or France, Germany, perhaps, would think, this guy's doing a great job. He's westernizing Russia, he's modernizing Russia. But for Spengler, no, he's doing a terrible job because he's trying to import a culture that has not grown on the soil of Russia. That's Spengler's view. Now, is that entirely correct? Who knows? But Spengler does make a pretty persuasive case for it, and this is one part of that. And he says the words East and West do contain real history. But Europe is an empty sound. Europe is an empty sound. Now tell that to somebody in Brussels. I'm not sure they'd believe you. Anyway, he says, this ancient medieval modern scheme, this rectilinear progression with meaningless proportions, becomes more and more preposterous with each century. And this is because, as the centuries go on, you've got to redefine the modern period and the medieval period relative to each other. And the modern just keeps getting stretched out, and this three-phase history is just too cute by half. It's a Procrustean bed, in Spengler's view. Now, he doesn't use that word, but I think that's a good word to use. So, Procrustes, ancient Greek myth of a guy. Travelers would come to his house and he had a bed, and if they were too tall for the bed, he would chop them down to size to fit the bed. If they were too short for the bed, he would stretch them out to fit the bed. So he thinks this ancient medieval modern scheme is a Procrustean bed for history. And so these ad hoc modifications to maintain it as time has gone on have just gotten worse and worse. And the ancient medieval modern scheme not only circumscribes the area of history, it rigs the stage. So I like that. I think that's, there's a lot of truth to that. And then, this is probably the really important point. It makes mighty faraway cultures revolve around Western Europe like the Ptolemaic Earth, right? Instead of the planets all revolving around the sun, and for him that sun would be kind of the form of world history. Instead of that, they're revolving around the Earth of Europe, this Eurocentric view, where great events in China, India, the Middle East, Africa, America, wherever, would all be seen in the perspective of Europe, and they would all look small next to Europe because that perspective is so focused on Europe at this time in the early 20th century. And he calls these Eurocentric histories phantom world histories. And he says it's ridiculous to oppose modern history of a few centuries against an ancient period of many millennia. And, there could be, I think there is truth to that, but on the other hand, if you look at the growth of technics, which is a concept that he's going to get into more in his later work, but just the growth of technology and the growth of these cultures, maybe there is reason to magnify certain decades and centuries, because he'll say that himself. And there's the classic Vladimir Lenin quote that sometimes there are centuries where nothing happens, and sometimes there are weeks where centuries happen. And so maybe it does make sense that this modern period of just a few hundred years could be of equal weight in a historical analysis with, the millennia of these non-historic peoples. Because for Spengler, again, he thinks people only have historicity. People only obtain what he would call history, because this is, again, your relation to the world and how the past flows through you into the future, and kind of your self-consciousness about that, and how a culture develops. So he thinks that each of these cultural organisms has its set lifespan, and it has a lot of vitality for a few centuries in there, maybe up to a millennium. It has great vitality, but outside of that span, it doesn't have vitality, and it's not a historic force. So the idea that there could be countless millennia in the past where nothing of historical note happens is actually entirely consonant with Spengler's wider thought. So as much as I think this criticism is good, that the modern of just a few centuries probably shouldn't be equated with maybe a 10,000 year, maybe more, ancient period, if we're really, taking the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, even into the Bronze Age, maybe even into the Iron Age, because, Rome and Greece, that's all Iron Age. Yeah, so that would certainly be ancient. So we're going all the way from the Paleolithic to the Iron Age. And yes, that probably doesn't deserve to all be squished together into one category. Well, we have our modern of just a couple centuries, and we think that's a category of equal weight to maybe 10,000 years spread all across the world. But at the same time, under Spenglerian thought, these prehistoric peoples wouldn't be very weighty in his world history. So I think there could be a contradiction there, but his point is well taken. And then he says, dumping into ancient history this whole mass of pre-Hellenic cultures is ridiculous. And he says, it's also the negation of the Indian, the Chinese, and the Mesoamerican cultures and their histories. So I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think this is actually, as much as Spengler is painted as a very right-wing guy, and Spengler is a conservative guy, I don't think there's any way to get around that he's fundamentally a right-wing guy with, some Nazi sympathies at the end of the day. Like, at the end of his life, with his book, The Hour of Decision, like, he's not a card-carrying Nazi, but he's trying to tell the Nazis how they can do things better. Like, that's what The Hour of Decision is all about, is like, how can I educate these Nazis to not suck as much and to bring pride to Germany, bring glory to Germany. That's what Spengler fundamentally wants. So he is a very right-wing guy, but then you're looking at these concepts, and there's a lot of consonance with a lot of left-wing thought. So, and you could say, well, that's a commonplace because you've got Martin Heidegger, and he was literally a card-carrying Nazi, and all these postmodernists love the guy. So, and maybe that's a piece of evidence towards the horseshoe theory of politics. The further you go left or right, the more these forces start to resemble each other. So, I don't know. There's food for thought there. And then this is where he really touts his project. He says, his comparative morphological approach, this is the Copernican discovery in the historical sphere. And so this is going to take away the Eurocentrism. Now we're going to be looking at the cultures as equals, because there's an intense cultural relativism to Spengler. As actually, he's truer to his cultural relativism in a lot of ways than the modern postmodernists are. So, anyway. And he says it's a Copernican discovery in the historical sphere because it admits no sort of privileged position to any culture. That's exactly it. There's no privileged position to any culture. And the further he gets into his thoughts, the more we're going to see that, because he doesn't believe that Western science or mathematics are inherently better than any other system, even though they provably provide the people who use them with more power over the world, which would be a fairly reasonable objective criterion of how good a system of thought is. How much does it help you in the world? I mean, that might be too pragmatic for these airy-fairy people out there who, I don't know, want to delude themselves about the quality of the world for whatever reason. But that's a very good criterion to judge. But Spengler would say, no, it's Western math and Western science, that's just an expression of the Western soul. It's no better than any other culture's science or mathematics, which are expressions of their soul. Each is a paradigm that fundamentally does not truly reflect reality, but that is just an expression of this soul. So I can't join him on that. I think there is an objective reality. We may never fully approach it, and we can only get a paradigm that approaches it as closely as we can, but certain paradigms approach reality better than other paradigms. To me, that's an axiomatic fact. I mean, it's just so self-evident that it's almost not even worth talking about. Anyway, so then I've gotten my notes here. So is he a postmodernist? Well, I think he is. He's a proto-postmodernist, and his thoughts are probably actually more sophisticated than most postmodernists. And so, there's some truth to his thought. I think it's sophisticated. I think it's very thought-provoking, but I can't go the whole hog with him because I believe certain types of mathematics and certain types of science and certain paradigms and certain technical capacities are different across cultures, and some are better and some are worse. And I'm probably never going to be persuaded of any other position. I'm open to arguments. I mean, I'd be very interested to hear arguments because I'd be very surprised if someone would persuade me, but I'm not going to sit here and say that I wouldn't entertain them. Anyway, he says, these other cultures in point of mass count for just as much in the general picture of history. And there's a lot of truth to that, If you're looking in this Eurocentric way or some nationalistic way, think about an American high school education. We focus on just U.S. history, a bit of world history, a bit of, kind of this like neo-Marxist gobbledygook. And it's all very American-centric or Eurocentric in some sort of way. Although I don't think American education is all that Eurocentric. It's just kind of America-centric and neo-Marxist-centric at this point. But anyway, you will miss out on a ton of history if you're not focused on these other cultures, if you just want to focus on the modern period. Like, I've got a good friend, very good friend, grew up with the guy, I love the guy, and he's an AP US history teacher now, and I was actually telling him about Spengler, and I was telling him about this other book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David W. Anthony, which I love because it's about the quest to find the Proto-Indo-European homeland and to find out when each language family split from Proto-Indo-European and where it probably split from. So I think that's fascinating. I think prehistoric history is more interesting to me than modern history because the problems are more difficult and they're deeper. You really have to get your historiography right. You've got to bring a lot of analytical tools to bear. Whereas with modern history, it's a lot easier to let yourself get lazy and just listen to whatever the popular opinions are about it. But so my buddy who teaches AP US history, I was telling him about the David W. Anthony book, and he was like, I couldn't really get interested in that, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Like, I'm interested in modern history. And I don't think that's right. I don't know. I mean, it's all a matter of taste, right? At some level, it's a matter of taste. So there is no right or wrong answer. But for me, I find the ancient stuff much more interesting, and I think my buddy, the AP US history teacher, kind of has a narrower view, and I think it might be a little bit too America-centric or modern-centric. Not sure what the right word there would be. But anyway, so then on to the final point. Now, Spengler doesn't say it in so many words, but at the end of this section, he kind of criticizes this fetishization of the classical, and he'll really get into that, especially when he criticizes the Renaissance period. But I just thought it was pretty good, and again, a lot of people of a postmodern or neo-Marxist or otherwise, what do I want to say? people who kind of denigrate the West and want to prop up all the other cultures, which, as long as you're actually engaging with those other cultures, like if you're actually like studying like Buddhist texts, or you're studying like Islamic texts or Jewish texts or Manichaean texts or anything else, or anything like that, and you really get into it and you think it's better than this Western stuff, I'm all for that. I totally support you in that. But if you're just sitting there and criticizing the West and you actually don't know anything about any of these other cultures, but you're just kind of throwing them up as these, quote unquote noble savages or these noble outsiders, I don't know. I think that's very superficial and very weak. But anyway, he concludes by saying that, we really prize the classical, but the classical is actually frequently surpassed in point of spiritual greatness and soaring power by these other cultures, that this Ptolemaic, this geocentric, this Eurocentric view of history beclouds us, that it clouds our vision, clouds us from seeing. So I thought that was good, and reading Spengler really has opened my eyes to that, because I was always a Greco-Roman guy, even more than Judeo-Christian. Well, because you're right, I was a very left-wing guy in my youth, right? Not that I'm particularly old just yet, but I don't feel like a spring chicken at the same time. And I was particularly far to the left, did not like anything Judeo-Christian, so I really latched onto the Greco-Roman stuff, and I just loved it. But even to the point where I didn't, like, now I'm learning so many things about medieval history that I find fascinating, or about, the birth of the Viking peoples, and wow, dude, I didn't have any idea that the Vikings had gone into Ukraine and basically, were very important in the early history of kind of the Russian and Ukrainian people. They sacked attempted to sack Constantinople many times, and that's how the Russian people developed their Christian Orthodox views. Those were brought by Viking people into the Ukrainian and Russian steppe, and that's how they got their focus on Constantinople. They call Moscow the Third Rome, because they really liked Constantinople, because these Viking invaders who ended up becoming the Kievan Rus really were fascinated by Constantinople and all these things. So I really agree with Spengler that we've had an over-fetishization of the Greco-Roman, the classical, and there's so much to learn about these other periods of history. Now, at the same time, I think Spengler draws many of his best historical analogies from the classical period. Now, is that because the classical period is better documented, because we are so interested in it? Or is it because there's more that's of historical value there? I don't know. I doubt that. It's probably because it's more well documented. That's my feeling, but I certainly can't prove that right now. But anyway, that's part 6 of the introduction of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. And this is really where he gets his good criticism of the ancient medieval modern scheme in, and he, for the first time in so many words, introduces his Copernican view of history. No longer will it be Eurocentric. Now it's these 9 cultures, each its own organism, each a discrete entity, developing in its own way, and each a very important historical artifact for us. Thanks very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Bye.